Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk says Europe must defend itself and encourages member states to boost military spending.
Environmental group Greenpeace wins a case against the Dutch state, ordered to cut their nitrogen deposition.
On his first full day as U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio met with his counterparts from Japan, India, and Australia. A day after a fire killed at least 76 people at a ski resort in Turkey, witnesses described harrowing scenes of panic.
Europe was, is, and will be great again. This is how Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk emphatically opened his speech on Wednesday in the European Parliament. With remarks similar to those of US President Donald Trump, he made a passionate plea for ramping up military spending to ensure the continent can defend itself against its adversaries without relying on the USA's security umbrella.
Jeśli Europa ma przetrwać, musi być uzbrojona. To nie jest nasz wybór. Ja nie jestem militarystą. Polska jest takim miejscem na ziemi, gdzie nikt nie ma ochoty na żadne powtórki z żadnej wojny.
Tusk said in order to avoid a tragic repetition of history, Europe must come up with flexible and creative ways of financing military expenditure. But this effort could involve the issuance of EU-wide debt. Poland is NATO's leader in defense spending, with a projected 4.7% of GDP for 2025. During his campaign, Trump said he would encourage Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want to NATO countries that fail to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense.
The European Union needs to boost its defence spending to prepare for the worst and be able to defend itself alone if needed, according to the bloc's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas. She said EU member states spent a collective average of 1.9% of their GDP on defence, while Russia was spending 9%.
There should be no doubt in any of our minds that we need to spend more to prevent war. But we also need to prepare for war. We need to improve our capabilities. We need our defense industry to produce what we need. We must prepare for the worst.
Over the next decade, Kallas said the EU will need at least €500 billion to remain competitive in defence. But so far, only around €13 billion has been earmarked in the EU's long-term budget from 2021 to 2027.
Environmental group Greenpeace won a legal battle against the Dutch state, which now must take more measures to limit nitrogen deposition, in a ruling delivered by the Hague Court on Wednesday. The decision compels the Dutch government to meet emission curbing targets by 2030, or it could face a fine of €10 million.
Bovendien heeft de huidige regering tot op heden geen beleid afgekondigd op grond waarvan met enige wetenschappelijke zekerheid kan worden aangenomen dat bij uitvoering daarvan het wettelijk stikstofdoel voor 2030 zal worden behaald. De rechtbank zal de staat dan ook een dwangsom opleggen voor het geval het wettelijk stikstofdoel voor 2030.
The court insisted that if the Netherlands doesn't impose sufficient regulatory measures to protect the environment, it is at risk of not adhering to EU law. A national rural area plan put in place by the previous cabinet offered the opportunity to get started with prioritizing sustainability, but that program is being abolished by the current cabinet.
Russia is intensifying its bombardment campaign as it strikes multiple Ukrainian cities. Moscow fired Iranian-made Shahed strike drones as it targeted the central city of Cherkasy. The attack caused some damage to properties in the vicinity. Locals say windows of 5 two-story residential buildings, a school and a retail store, as well as some doors completely blew out. In the eastern city of Pokrovsk, the Kremlin launched a barrage of more than 130 Shahed drones, as well as numerous decoy drones, according to the Ukrainian Air Force. Local authorities say 3 multi-story buildings and 3 houses suffered extensive damage. The drones set ablaze a large portion of a 9-story building, covering 1 square kilometer. And in Dnipro, more than 150 houses suffered damage of varying degree, and 2 two-story buildings were reduced to rubble as Moscow's rockets pummeled the area. At least 2 people sustained injuries and were transferred to medical centers for treatment. Locals say the attacks were like a nightmare.
На мене. Я як заору. Ну, дітей же ж треба було поїти. Син перейшов сюди, повна хата стекла, там перебіг сюди. Ну, потім другий раз, як шандарахнуло. Ті двері відлетіли аж до окна. Ну, це був, звісно, кошмар. Не думала, що в 40 років остатися під відкритим небом.
The Kremlin's attacks also extended to the northeast of the country, targeting Ukraine's second-largest city, Kharkiv. Regional officials say the attacks there caused minor damage to some properties in the area, and no casualties were reported.
On his first full day as U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio met with his counterparts from Japan, India, and Australia, a group known as the Quad. The grouping of the 4 countries has been seen by many as an initiative to counter or at least slow China's increasing assertiveness in the region. Rubio is known for his hardline stance against China, and the timing of the meeting suggests combating China's influence will remain a top priority for Trump and his chief diplomat. After his confirmation, Rubio stressed that he will execute President Trump's America First mantra in his foreign policy.
In our republic, the voters decide the course of our nation, both domestically and abroad. And they have elected Donald J. Trump as our president when it comes to foreign policy on a very clear mission. And that mission is to ensure that our foreign policy is centered on one thing, and that is the advancement of our national interest, which they have clearly defined through his campaign as anything that makes us stronger or safer or more prosperous.
But just as Donald Trump brings his more unilateralist approach against China back to the White House, China is also seeking to improve relations with U.S. allies. From China's point of view, improving relations with countries like Japan and India and increasing economic cooperation will offset the shock to China-U.S. economic relations.
The newly sworn-in US President Donald Trump defended his decision to grant clemency to people convicted of assaulting police officers during the 2021 attack on the Capitol. He used his first hours back in the Oval Office to erase the records of more than 200 people who pled guilty to assaulting officers at the Capitol 4 years ago, and freed around 1,500 people convicted of trying to overthrow the government.
If you look at the American public is tired of it. Take a look at the election. Just look at the numbers on the election. We won this election in a landslide because the American public is tired of people like you that are just one-sided, horrible people in terms of crime. You don't talk about all the people that have been killed.
The new US president said the sentences handed down were ridiculous and excessive, and described the rioters as people who actually love our country. Trump also suggested there could be a place in US politics for the far-right Proud Boys and Oath Keeper groups, who organized and rallied supporters to violence in the chaos that unraveled on the 6th of January. As protests erupt against executive orders by Donald Trump to clamp down on the rights of immigrants in the US, Venezuela's president says the country is waiting for migrants to return home. Nicolas Maduro's comments come after Washington and the US Customs and Border Protection announced that the CBP One app would no longer be used to admit migrants into the country.
Migrantes saben que su regreso a Venezuela recupera muchas cosas. El respeto como seres humanos, pero también su derecho a venir a rumbear con su familia, con sus panas. ¿Cuánto sufre un migrante por allá? En Chicago, en Nueva York, cuando ve a sus panas jueves, viernes, sábado y domingo rumbeando aquí.
Millions of Venezuelans were driven from the country during Maduro's decade-long rule after facing political unrest and economic decline. After Maduro was sworn in for a third term, the EU and US both denounced his inauguration as illegitimate amid allegations of fraudulent vote counting.
A day after a fire killed at least 76 people at a ski resort in northwestern Turkey, emergency workers continued to search for bodies. Sheets used by escapees dangled from the blackened windows. Witnesses described harrowing scenes of panic as hotel guests attempted to escape.
Çocuklar bağırıyordu, yardım edin diyordu. Anneleri babaları da çocuklar var diyordu. Lütfen yardım edin, yanıyoruz diyordular. İşte itfaiye falan arayın. Biz de sakinleşmeye çalışıyorduk. Hani elimizden bir şey gelmiyordu, içeri de giremiyorduk. Bayağı yüksekti. İp falan da uzatamıyorduk tabii. Hani elimizden geleni yapmaya çalışıyorduk.
The Turkish government appointed 6 prosecutors to lead an investigation into the blaze, which is believed to have started in the hotel's restaurant section. At least 9 people have been detained for questioning, including the hotel owner. Two people, including a 2-year-old boy, were killed and 2 more were injured in a stabbing attack in Bavaria. Police said a suspect was detained in the knife attack, which occurred in a park in the southern German town of Aschaffenburg. Train services in the town were temporarily interrupted as the suspect tried to flee from police along the tracks. The motive and whether the suspect knew the victims is being investigated by the police.
Euronews. The news.